Before linen was cloth, before it was a shirt, or a sheet, or a folded towel resting in a wooden chest, it was a plant, a very ordinary-looking plant, standing in a field with thin green stems and small blue flowers that opened softly in the morning light. Flax does not look especially strong. It does not look like something that could become fabric. It looks delicate, almost shy, moving a little when the wind passes over it. And yet, hidden inside those slender stalks, there is a long fiber, not wool, growing from the back of an animal, not silk, spun by a worm, not cotton, gathered from a soft white bowl. Linen begins as a thread inside a stem. That is the quiet surprise of it. For thousands of years, people learned how to find that thread. They learned that the useful part of the plant was not on the outside where you could see it easily, but in the length of the stalk itself, held between the woody core and the outer skin. To reach it, they had to work slowly. They had to pull the flax from the ground, dry it, soak it, loosen it, break it, scrape it, comb it, spin it, and finally weave it. Every step asked for patience. Every step could be done badly, and if it was done badly, the linen would show it. So linen was never just a material, it was a record of careful work. If you enjoy slow, quiet histories like this, feel free to subscribe to Night Pages and like the video so more calm stories can find their way to sleepy listeners. Now, when we think of thread, we often imagine something already finished, a smooth line wound on a spool, something bought in a shop, clean and even, ready to pass through the eye of a needle. But in the older world, thread was not something separate from the landscape. It came from fields, it came from rain and soil, from the timing of harvest, from the feel of wet stalks in the hands, from the smell of plants left to soften under dew or in a pond. A linen sheet began long before the bed. It began with seeds scattered into prepared earth. It began with a crop that had to be watched and judged and taken at the right moment. Too early and the fiber was weak. Too late and the stalk became coarse. The plant had to be understood almost the way a baker understands dough or a potter understands clay. This is what we will follow, not the history of kings wearing linen, though kings did wear it. Not only the fine cloth kept for churches, merchants, and wealthy households, though that mattered too. We will follow the making itself, the ordinary transformation, a plant lifted from the field and slowly persuaded to become thread. And for now it is enough just to imagine the flax standing quietly in the morning, blue flowers open for a few hours, thin stems close together, each one holding a pale fiber inside, waiting for hands that know how to find it.
Before linen could be cloth, before it could be thread, before anyone could fold it into a shirt or lay it across a bed, it began in a field, not a field of soft fabric, of course, not anything that looked especially comfortable, just a patch of earth planted with flax, a narrow-stemmed plant with small leaves and pale blue flowers. If you passed it at the right time of year, early in the morning, it might look almost like a low blue mist resting above the ground. The flowers opened quietly in the cool part of the day, delicate and brief, and by afternoon many of them would already be gone. Flax was not grown like wheat, with the main hope of heavy grain. It was grown for the long fibers hidden inside its stalks. Those fibers ran up and down the plant, fine and strong, tucked between the woody core and the outer skin. The whole work of linen making was, in a way, the slow task of persuading those fibers to come free without breaking them too much. So the field mattered from the very beginning. The soil had to be prepared carefully. Flax liked a fine, even seedbed with the ground broken small and smooth. Stones and clods were trouble, because flax plants were slender, and the better the field, the straighter the stems could grow. A farmer might plow, harrow, rake, and level the earth until it was soft enough to receive the seed evenly. Then the seed was sown thickly. This is one of the quiet little details that tells you the purpose of the crop. If flax was being grown mainly for seed oil, it could be spaced more widely so the plants had room to branch. But if it was being grown for linen, it was sown close. Crowded plants grew tall and straight, reaching upward toward the light, with fewer side branches. Fewer branches meant smoother fibers. A crowded field made a finer thread.
So the future cloth began with closeness, thousands of thin stems standing beside one another, each one encouraged not to spread but to rise. Through spring and early summer, the field asked for watching more than force. Weeds had to be kept down because young flax did not compete well. Too much rain could lodge the stems, pressing them over. Too little could stunt them. The farmer could guide some things, but not all of them. Weather still had its hand in every shirt, every sheet, every towel that would one day come from the crop. And when the flax flowered, it did so gently. The blossoms were small, usually blue, sometimes white, opening above the green stems for a short time. They were beautiful, but they were not the harvest. The real treasure was hidden lower down in the length of the stalk. To look at a flax field, you would not immediately see cloth, you would see plants. Ordinary plants bending a little in the wind, but inside them was a kind of stored patience. The field was holding thread before anyone had spun it. It was holding linen before anyone had woven it. And all of it was waiting for the moment when hands would come into the field and begin the long work of taking the plant apart.
By the time the flax was ready to harvest, the field had changed its character. The blue flowers were mostly gone. The green stems had turned paler, with a yellow cast near the bottom, and the seed bowls at the top had begun to dry and rattle softly when the wind moved through them. The flax field at this stage was not quite dead, and not quite alive in the bright way of spring. It was waiting. For linen, the timing mattered. If the plants were taken too early, the fibers inside the stems were fine but weak. If they were left too long, the fibers grew coarser, stronger perhaps, but less suited to smooth cloth. So the harvest was judged by eye, by touch, and by memory. People looked at the color of the stem, the firmness of the seed head, the looseness of the leaves. They did not need a dial or a gauge. They had the field in front of them, and the knowledge of other years behind them. Flax was not usually cut like wheat. It was pulled. This is one of the quiet differences between linen and many other old crops. A sickle could cut the stems quickly, but it would leave the root in the ground and shorten the useful fiber. The long fibers used for good linen ran down the length of the plant. The longer the stem remained, the better the thread might be. So the harvesters bent down and took the flax by the handful close to the earth and pulled it up by the roots. It was slow work. A person moved along the row with a steady rhythm. Gather, grip, pull, shake, lay aside, gather, grip, pull, shake, lay aside. The roots came up with a little soil clinging to them. The plants were straightened by hand, the seed heads kept together, the stems aligned as neatly as possible. This neatness was not just tidiness, it made every later step easier. Retting, drying, breaking, scutching, hackling, all of it depended in some small way on how the plants were handled at the beginning. The pulled flax was tied into small bundles, often called sheaves or beats, depending on the place. These bundles were not heavy like sheaves of grain. They were light, narrow, and fibrous, with a dry whispering sound when they brushed against one another. Set upright in the field, they made little pale rows leaning together to dry. In the low sun, a flax harvest could look almost silver. There was labor in it, of course. Backs bent for hours. Hands grew rough from stems and roots. Soil got under fingernails. The work was often shared by families and neighbors because flax demanded many hands at certain moments and then patience at others. No one person made linen alone. Even before the spinning wheel, before the loom, before the cloth, there was this gathering in the field. And when the day was finished, the plants no longer stood growing in the ground. They lay in bundles, quiet and orderly, carrying within them the long hidden fibers that would one day become thread. After the flax had been pulled from the field and the seed heads had been saved or combed away, the stalks still did not yet look like linen. They were only bundles of dry, pale plants. If you bent one between your fingers, it snapped like straw. Inside each stalk, hidden behind the woody outer part, lay the long fibers that people wanted, but they were held in place by natural gums and pectins, little plant glues that bound the useful fiber to the rest of the stem. So the flax had to be retted. Retting is one of those old words that sounds simple once you know it. It means rotting, but carefully, not destroying the plant, not letting it turn to waste, but allowing water, time, and tiny living organisms to loosen what the hands could not loosen by force alone.
It was a controlled decay, a quiet surrender of the stalk. There were two common ways to do it. In some places, the flax was laid in ponds, streams, ditches, or slow rivers. The bundles were weighted down with stones, boards, or wooden poles so they stayed beneath the surface. The water moved around them, it entered the stems, it softened the bonds inside. Day after day the bundles changed, they darkened, they grew slippery to the touch. The smell could be strong, earthy, sour, and not especially pleasant. Villages sometimes kept retting ponds away from drinking water because everyone knew this was useful work, but not clean work. The worker had to judge the timing. Too little retting and the fiber would cling stubbornly to the woody stem. Too much and the fiber itself would weaken, becoming dull and fragile. There was no machine to measure this. A person lifted a stalk, broke it, pulled at it, felt it between the fingers. The knowledge lived in the body, in the slight resistance of the stem, in the way the fibers began to separate, in the color of the water and the smell rising from it. Dew retting was slower and gentler. Instead of sinking the flax in water, people spread it out across a meadow or stubble field in thin rows. The night dew settled on it. The morning sun dried it. Rain came and went. The stalks lay there for weeks, weathering quietly under the sky. They were turned now and then with wooden rakes so both sides would soften evenly. Dew-retted flax often became gray or silvery, touched by the open air. It did not rot as quickly as water-retted flax, but it could be easier to control, and it needed no pond. In either case, the work was patient. The flax was not being made into linen yet. It was only being persuaded to let go of itself. The hard stalk, the soft fiber, the outer skin, the inner wood, all these parts had grown together in the field as one plant. Retting began the separation, and when the time was right, the bundles were lifted from the water or gathered from the grass and set out to dry again. They still looked rough.
After the flax had been retted, and after it had dried again in the open air, it no longer looked quite like the plant that had stood in the field. It was still flax, of course. The bundles were still long and pale and straw-like, but something inside them had changed. The wetting, the waiting, the slow work of dew or pond water had loosened the bond between the woody stalk and the fine fiber hidden beneath it. The plant had begun very gently to come apart. Now came the breaking. This was not yet the making of thread. It was still earlier than that. The flax was not soft. It was not clean. It was not ready for spinning. It was only a dry stalk with treasure inside it, and the worker had to persuade the hard outer body of the plant to release what it had been holding all summer. The tool used for this was called a flax brake, or sometimes a brake. It was a simple wooden device, usually set on legs, with a hinged upper blade that came down between lower wooden slats. It did not cut like a knife. That was important. A sharp edge would have damaged the long fibers. The brake crushed and cracked instead. It broke the woody core of the stalk into small pieces while leaving the flax fibers as whole as possible. A handful of retted flax was laid across the lower part of the brake. Then the upper arm was lifted and brought down, not violently, not carelessly, just with steady force. Lift, drop, lift, drop. The dry stalks snapped and splintered with a light, brittle sound, a soft cracking, a papery rustle. Dust rose from the bundle. Bits of broken stem, pale and sharp and dry, began to fall away. The worker turned the flax, shifted it, fed another section through, and brought the brake down again. The motion was repetitive, and it had to be repeated many times. Too little breaking, and the woody shives would cling stubbornly to the fiber. Too much, and the fiber itself could be weakened. Like so many old crafts, the right amount was learned by the hand. You can imagine the scene in a yard or beside a barn on a dry day after retting season. Bundles of flax waiting nearby, a wooden brake worn smooth where many hands had used it, the smell of dry straw and faint earth, the small pieces of stem gathering around the worker's feet.
Nothing about it was delicate in appearance, and yet the purpose was delicate. The aim was to break what was brittle while preserving what was strong. Inside each stalk, the useful fibers ran lengthwise like quiet threads already suggested by the plant itself. The break did not create those fibers, it only removed the first obstacle around them. The plant had done the growing, water and time had done the loosening, now wood and hand did the breaking. And when the bundle had been worked enough, it looked rougher than before, not finer. It was bent, crushed, messy, with fragments still caught among the fibers. But that was how linen moved forward, not by becoming beautiful all at once.
After the flax stalks had been retted, dried, and broken, they still were not linen. Not yet. The useful fiber was there, running in long pale lines down the length of the plant, but it was still mixed with small pieces of woody stem. These bits were called shives. They clung to the fiber after breaking, like dry splinters caught in hair. So the next work was scutching. Scutching was a cleaning step. It did not make the flax fine. That would come later, with the iron combs of hackling. Scutching was rougher, simpler, and very necessary. Its purpose was to knock away the broken woody matter, leaving the long flax fibers freer, lighter, and more ready to be drawn into thread. A worker would take a handful of broken flax and hold it over a standing board, often a smooth upright plank set into a simple frame. The flax hung down in a loose sheet. Then, with a flat wooden blade, the worker struck or scraped downward along the fibers, not too hard, not wildly, but with a practiced repeated motion, down the flax, again and again. The blade pushed the shives away. The little dry fragments fell to the floor in a soft, rustling scatter. It was dusty work, quiet in one way but not silent. There was the dull tap of wood against fiber, the rasp of the blade, the faint crackle of broken stem, the shifting sound of handfuls being turned and shaken. Around the feet of the workers, the floor slowly gathered a pale litter of chaff and splinters. The tool itself was plain. A scutching knife was not a knife in the cutting sense. It was usually a wooden blade shaped a little like a broad paddle or a flattened sword. Its edge did not need to be sharp. In fact, sharpness would have damaged the fiber. The point was not to cut the flax but to persuade the useless part to let go. This is one of the quiet lessons of old handwork. Much of it was not force. It was pressure applied in the right direction, at the right time, after the material had already been prepared to yield. The retting had loosened the plant. The breaking had cracked the stem. Now scutching simply continued what those earlier steps had begun. A good worker could feel the difference. If the flax had been retted well, the shives came away more easily. If it had been under-retted, the woody parts held tight and the work became slow and stubborn. If it had gone too far in the water or dew, the fiber itself could weaken. Every stage spoke to the next one. As the handful was scutched, its color changed. It became cleaner, lighter, more fibrous. What had once been a plant stem began to look like something closer to hair or straw-colored silk, though still coarse and uneven. The long fibers hung in soft strands. The shorter broken pieces remained mixed in, but the main shape of linen was beginning to appear. Then the worker turned the bundle. After the flax had been broken and scutched, it no longer looked quite like a plant. The woody stem had been cracked away. The loose shives had fallen to the floor. What remained in the worker's hand was something pale, fibrous, and soft-looking. Though not yet soft enough for fine linen, it was a long bundle of flax, hanging in uneven strands, with bits of straw still caught inside it, and shorter fibers clinging among the longer ones. This was when the flax was brought to the hackles. A hackle was a simple tool, but not a gentle-looking one. It was a board set with rows of sharp iron teeth, like a heavy comb fixed upright on a bench. Some hackles had coarse teeth, spaced widely apart. Others had finer teeth, set close together, for the later passes. The worker did not comb the flax as one might comb hair with a small hand comb. The motion was larger, slower, and more deliberate. A handful of flax was held firmly at one end. Then the worker drew it down through the iron teeth. The fibers caught, resisted, and then slid through with a dry whispering sound. Bits of broken stem stayed behind in the teeth. Tangled short fibers pulled loose. Dust rose in the light. The long strands began to separate and lie more nearly parallel. Again the bundle was lifted. Again it was drawn through the comb. There was a rhythm to it. Lift, draw, shake, lift, draw, shake. The iron teeth did not spin or turn. They waited in their wooden base, fixed and patient, while the hands did the work. A careless pull could waste good fiber. Too rough a motion could snap strands that had already taken months to grow, weeks to ret, and many hours to clean. So the worker had to feel the resistance through the hands and wrists. The flax told them how hard to pull. The first hackling removed the roughest matter. The next comb was finer, then finer again if the household or workshop needed very good thread. Each pass left the longest, smoothest fibers more ordered than before. They began to shine faintly, not with the polish of finished cloth, but with a quiet plant luster of their own. Good line flax, carefully hackled, could hang like pale hair from the hand. What came out of the comb was not thrown away. The shorter tangled fibers called tow were gathered too. Tow could be spun into coarser yarn used for rough cloth, sacking, padding, rope, or many other humble things. In an older household, waste was rarely just waste. It was only material waiting for a less delicate purpose. Hackling was one of those stages where linen became more clearly divided by quality. The finest fibers would go on to make smoother, stronger thread. The shorter fibers would become something plainer. Both were useful. Both came from the same field, the same blue flowers, the same pulled stalks drying in the weather. And when the hackling was finished, the flax was no longer a mass of tangled plant fiber. It had been straightened.
Motion calm, the flax reached the spinner. It no longer looked much like a plant. The stiff stalk had been retted, broken, scraped, and combed away. What remained was a soft, pale bundle of fiber, smooth and cool in the hand, with a faint, dry shine to it. It was not yet linen. It was only the possibility of linen. To make cloth, those loose fibers had to become thread, and thread, before machines, was made slowly, one length at a time, one twist at a time. The spinner often began by fastening the dressed flax to a distaff. A distaff was simply a staff or rod that held the fibers in place. It might be tucked under the arm, fixed to a spinning wheel, or held upright beside the body. The flax was tied loosely, not packed tight, so the spinner could draw out small strands as needed. Too much at once, and the thread became lumpy. Too little, and it snapped. The work depended on the fingers. The spinner pulled a few fibers forward from the bundle, letting them overlap just enough. Flax fibers are long, but they do not become thread by lying side by side. They need twist. Twist is what grips them together. Twist turns a small cloud of fibers into something strong enough to be wound, washed, woven, and worn. In older times, this twisting was done with a drop spindle. The spindle was a small weighted stick, set turning by the hand and allowed to hang from the forming thread. As it spun, it added twist. The spinner drew more flax from the distaff, let the twist run upward into the fibers, then wound the finished thread onto the spindle and began again. Draw, twist, wind, draw, twist, wind. A motion repeated so often that it could become almost part of breathing. Later, the spinning wheel made the same work faster, though not effortless. The wheel turned the spindle continuously, while the spinner controlled the thread with both hands. One hand drew the fibers out, the other steadied them and decided how much twist they should take. For fine linen thread, this control mattered very much. Too little twist, and the thread would drift apart. Too much, and it became wiry and hard. Often the spinner kept the fingers slightly damp. A small bowl of water might sit nearby, or the spinner might moisten the fingers by touch. Dampness helped smooth the flax and lay down the tiny loose ends. It made a cleaner, finer thread. This is one reason linen spinning had its own quiet rhythm. The feel of the fiber changed under the fingertips. Dry flax resisted, slightly damp flax obeyed. Fine spinning was skilled work. It asked for patience, good light, steady hands, and long practice.
A person could not simply force the flax into thread. The fiber had to be persuaded, pulled gently, twisted evenly, watched for thick places and weak places, corrected before they moved too far down the line, and so
Once the flax had been spun into thread, the work was still not finished. A spindle full of yarn was not yet ready for the loom. It had to be taken off, wound, measured, sorted and prepared so that it could be used without tangling. This was quiet work, often done indoors, in the softer hours of the day when the hardest pulling and beating of the flax was already behind them. The new thread was delicate. It had come from long plant fibers, twisted together by hand, and though it could be surprisingly strong, it still needed care. A sudden pull could snap it. A rough edge of wood could catch it. Damp fingers could make it cling. So the spinner worked slowly, letting the thread pass through the hand, feeling for uneven places. A thin place might need to be watched. A lump of tow might be picked away. A section that had been twisted too tightly might be noticed by the way it curled back on itself. The yarn was often wound from the spindle onto a reel or swift, making a looped skein. The reel gave the yarn a regular length. With each turn the thread traveled around the wooden arms, round and round until a measured bundle began to form. In some places the reel would click after a certain number of turns, marking the count. That small sound, repeated now and then, helped the worker keep track without much thought. Turn after turn, thread after thread, a soft wooden creak, a quiet click, the faint dry whisper of linen yarn moving over wood. Once wound into skeins, the yarn could be tied in a few places so it would not fall into a knot. A skein of linen yarn looks simple, almost weightless, but it holds many hours of work inside it. The growing of the flax, the pulling, the retting, the breaking and scutching, the combing and spinning, all of that was now gathered into a pale loop that could be hung from a peg or laid carefully in a basket. Before weaving, the yarn might be cleaned, dampened, or lightly sized depending on local practice and the fineness of the thread. Linen behaves differently from wool. It is smoother, less springy, and less forgiving. Wool has a softness that helps it cling to itself. Linen is more direct. It keeps its line. It shows mistakes clearly. This is part of what made fine linen so valued, and also what made it demanding. The stronger, smoother threads were often chosen for the warp. The long threads stretched on the loom. The weft which passes back and forth across them could sometimes be a little less perfect, so the yarn was not all treated as one thing. It was looked at, judged and sorted by touch and sight. The best lengths were saved for the places where strength mattered most. In a small room beside a window, a person winding linen yarn might not appear to be doing anything grand. There is no great movement, no loud tool, no bright transformation, only hands, thread, wood, and patience. But this stage mattered. A badly wound skein could waste hours. A tangled thread could slow the loom. A weak Before linen became cloth, it had to pass through one more patient device, the loom. A loom before factories was not a roaring machine. It did not fill a building with iron noise. It was usually made of wood, built to the size of a room or the size of a cottage corner, or sometimes smaller, depending on the cloth being woven. It creaked a little. It shifted under the weight of the work. It smelled faintly of timber, oil, dust, and dry thread. The purpose of the loom was simple, but the simplicity hid a great deal of skill. Threads had to cross one another in an orderly way. Some threads ran lengthwise, held tight from front to back. These were the warp threads. Others passed across them from side to side. These were the weft threads. Linen cloth was made by the steady crossing of warp and weft, over and under, again and again. But first the loom had to be dressed. That was the word often used, and it is a good one. The loom was prepared almost like a body being clothed. The warp threads were measured out, often in long lengths, because a mistake here would remain in the cloth all the way to the end. Each thread had to be kept separate. Each thread had to be guided into place. If the yarn tangled, or crossed wrongly, or pulled unevenly, the woven linen would show it. The warp was wound onto a beam at the back of the loom.
From there it passed forward through loops, eyes or heddles, which could lift some threads while leaving others down. Then it passed through the reed, a comb-like frame that kept the threads spaced evenly and helped beat the new weft into place. At the front, the finished cloth slowly gathered on another beam. To weave, the weaver opened a shed, which was the narrow space between raised and lowered warp threads. Through that space went the shuttle, carrying the weft thread. In some looms the shuttle was passed by hand, in others it was thrown from one side to the other. Then the reed came forward with a soft thud, pressing the new thread into the growing cloth. This was repeated for hours. Lift the threads, pass the shuttle, beat the weft, change the shed, pass the shuttle back, beat again. The rhythm was not fast by modern standards, but it was steady. A good weaver watched the edge of the cloth, the tension of the threads, the evenness of the surface. Too loose, and the linen would be weak. Too tight, and the cloth would stiffen or draw in. Broken threads had to be mended at once with small knots and careful fingers. In a quiet room, the loom made a domestic music, wood against wood, thread sliding over thread, the small breath of the shuttle as it crossed the warp. Outside there might be weather, animals, voices, ordinary life. Inside, the cloth lengthened by inches, and slowly, from thousands of pale flax threads, something familiar began to appear. Not fiber, not yarn, cloth.
Now the thread is ready to become cloth. It has been pulled from the flax plant, dried, retted, broken, scutched, combed, spun, and wound. It has passed through many hands already. By the time it reaches the loom, it no longer looks much like a plant. It is pale thread, fine and dry, with a slight unevenness that tells you it was made by hand. Plain linen was woven in the simplest way, one thread over, one thread under. Then the next row reversed it, under, then over, back and forth, again and again, until loose yarn became a firm, useful fabric. But simple does not mean careless. The first task was to prepare the warp. These were the long threads stretched lengthwise on the loom. They had to be measured carefully because they determined the length of the cloth. If the warp was too short, the cloth would be short. If the threads were crossed, tangled, or unevenly spaced, the weaving would punish the mistake every few inches. So the weaver worked slowly. The warp threads were set in order, each one held under tension. They passed through small loops or eyes called heddles, which allowed some threads to be lifted while others stayed down. This opening between raised and lowered threads was called the shed. Through that little space the weaver passed the weft. The weft was the cross thread. It might be wound on a shuttle, a small smooth tool shaped to carry yarn through the warp. The weaver pushed or threw the shuttle from one side to the other, then drew it back on the next pass. Each time the weft crossed through the shed. After every pass, the new thread had to be beaten into place, not violently, just firmly. A reed or beater pressed the thread back against the growing cloth, keeping the weave close and even. Too hard, and the cloth became stiff and narrow. Too soft, and it became loose and open. The hand had to learn the right pressure. This was one of those old skills that lived partly in the body. The feet might work treadles to lift the heddles. The hands guided the shuttle and beat the weft. The eyes watched the edges. The ears heard the small wooden sounds of the loom. A creak, a tap, a soft slide, a pause to mend a broken thread. Linen yarn was not always forgiving. It could be strong, but it had little stretch. Wool could give a little under strain. Linen resisted. If the warp was drawn too tight, threads might snap. If the air was too dry, the yarn might become brittle. In some places, weaving linen was easier in damp weather, or in rooms where moisture helped the fibers behave. Slowly, a length of plain cloth gathered on the beam. It was not yet the soft white linen people remember in folded sheets and shirts. It was more raw than that, slightly stiff, perhaps grayish or cream-colored, marked by tiny irregularities from the spinning and weaving, but it was cloth now. The field had become thread, thread had become fabric, and the loom with its patient crossing of lines had made something wide enough to cover a table, wrap a body, or lie beneath a sleeping head. After the linen came from the loom, it was not yet the pale, clean cloth that many people imagine when they think of old linen sheets or shirts. Freshly woven linen was often grey, tan, or a soft brownish cream. The color came from the plant itself, from small traces of gum and oil still held in the fiber, and from all the damp, earthy stages the flax had passed through before it became thread. So there was another slow piece of work to do. The cloth had to be bleached. Before chemical bleaching became common, this was mostly a matter of water, sunlight, air, and time. There were bleaching fields, or bleaching greens, where long lengths of linen were spread out over grass in the open weather. Sometimes they lay near a river or a stream, because the cloth needed to be wetted again and again. A person might carry water in buckets, or use a shallow channel, or simply take advantage of dew and rain. The linen was stretched out carefully, not in a tight, harsh way, but evenly, so the sun could reach as much of it as possible. Wooden pegs might hold the corners down. If the cloth was folded or wrinkled, those hidden places would bleach more slowly and the color would come out uneven, so the work required attention but not speed. It was the kind of task that asked people to return to it day after day, making small adjustments. In the morning, the cloth might be wet with dew. Later, when the sun rose higher, the moisture warmed and lifted from the surface. The fibers dried. Then someone would wet them again. This repeating cycle helped loosen the remaining color in the linen. Sunlight did its quiet part. So did oxygen in the air. So did the clean water passing again and again through the woven threads. There was no instant transformation. The cloth did not turn white in one afternoon. It faded slowly, from grey-brown to pale oatmeal, from pale oatmeal to cream, and, if the weather was kind and the work continued long enough, from cream toward a soft white. A bleaching field must have been a calm sight from a distance. Strips of cloth lying across the grass like low pale paths. Women or men walking between them with buckets. The sound of water poured out in sheets. The smell of wet linen, green grass, and sun-warmed earth. Birds moving in the hedges, clouds passing over, briefly dimming the work and then the light returning. But it was also vulnerable work. Rain could help, but too much wet weather slowed the process. Dirt could splash up from the ground. Animals might walk across the cloth. Smoke, dust, or careless handling could stain what had taken weeks to lighten. A good white linen was not simply a color, it was stored labor, it was weather, patience, and repeated care made visible. And even when the linen never became perfectly white, that was all right. Most old linen was not the sharp, bright white of modern. After linen had been woven and whitened in the sun, it was still not quite the cloth people wanted against the skin. It was clean. It was pale. It had the shape of something useful, but it could still be stiff in the hand, especially when it was new. Fresh linen has a firmness to it. The threads have been pulled tight on the loom, crossed and beaten into place, then dried and bleached and handled over and over. The cloth remembers all of that tension. It can feel crisp, almost papery, with a slight resistance when it is folded. Before machines, softening linen was not a single step so much as a slow persuasion. Some of it happened through washing. The cloth might be soaked again, rinsed, wrung, and spread out to dry. Water entered the fibers and loosened them a little. Hands twisted the fabric. The weight of wet linen pulled at itself. When it dried, it was not exactly the same as before. Each washing made a small difference. Then came working the cloth by hand. A length of linen could be rubbed between the palms, rolled, pulled, shaken, folded and unfolded. In some households it was beaten gently with a wooden bat or mallet, not to damage it, but to break the last harshness from the fibers. The sound would have been dull and regular, cloth on wood, wood on cloth, a small domestic rhythm repeated until the linen began to give. In some places, smooth stones, wooden rollers, or glass smoothing tools were used to press and polish the surface. The cloth might be laid flat on a board and rubbed with a rounded stone or wound around a roller and worked back and forth. This could give linen a faint sheen, a quiet smoothness that caught the light, not glossy like silk.
not rich in that way, just clean, firm, and softly reflective. There was also time. Linen is one of those materials that improves through use. A new sheet might feel cool and stiff at first, but after many washings, many nights, many foldings into chests and unfoldings onto beds, it became gentler. Shirts softened at the collar and cuff. Towels became more absorbent. Table linen lost its first sharpness and settled into the life of the house. This is one reason old linen was valued so carefully. It was not only the work of growing flax, retting it, breaking it, combing it, spinning it, weaving it, and bleaching it. It was also the work of years. A piece of linen carried the memory of use. It had been handled by mothers, daughters, servants, wives, husbands, washerwomen, and children sent to help with the folding. To soften linen was to make it more human. The plant had already become fiber, and the fiber had become thread, and the thread had become cloth. Now the cloth was becoming something closer to the body, something that could lie against the neck, something that could cover a sleeping child, something that could be folded at the end of a long day and placed back into a wooden chest, ready for the next washing, the next wearing, the next quiet use.
By the time a length of linen was ready to become a shirt or a sheet, it had already passed through many quiet transformations. It had been a green plant in a field. It had stood in water or dew until the woody stem loosened. It had been broken, scraped, combed, spun, woven, bleached, and softened. Now it lay on a table or across a woman's lap, pale and folded, waiting for the needle. Linen clothing before machines was often cut with great care because cloth was not something to waste. A shirt was not shaped in the modern way with curved pieces and many scraps left over. It was usually made from rectangles and squares, arranged so that nearly every inch of fabric could be used. The body might be two broad panels. The sleeves were long rectangles. Small square gussets were placed under the arms, giving room to move. Triangular pieces might widen the sides. The shape was simple, but it was not crude. It was a practical geometry learned over generations. The sewing was done by hand with linen thread, waxed sometimes with a little beeswax so it passed more smoothly through the cloth. Seams were worked closely and patiently. The edges were folded in and stitched down so they would not fray in the wash. A shirt might have a slit at the neck, small gathers at the collar, narrow cuffs at the wrists, and ties or buttons depending on place and period. The garment was plain, but it held a great deal of skill. Linen shirts were worn next to the skin. They protected outer garments from sweat and body oils, and they could be washed more often than wool or silk. For many people, the linen shirt was the layer that made daily clothing bearable, cool in warm weather, absorbent and smoother with use. It carried the mark of work and sleep and washing. It was not just something owned, it was something lived in. Sheets were simpler in shape, but no less valued. A sheet was a large expanse of woven linen, sometimes made by joining narrower loom widths with a long central seam. The seam had to be flat because it would be felt by the body in the night. A good linen sheet was heavy enough to lie smoothly, but fine enough to feel cool under the hand. When newly washed and dried in the open air, it held the faint smell of sun, grass, ash soap, and wind. In many households, linen was stored carefully in chests. Shirts, shifts, tablecloths, towels, and sheets were folded in layers. Some were marked with initials, some were part of a marriage portion gathered slowly over years. A stack of linen in a chest was a form of security. It meant cleanliness, comfort, readiness, and household order. But linen was not kept perfect forever. It wore thin at elbows, collars, cuffs, and the middle of sheets. It was patched, turned, cut down, and reused. A worn sheet might become smaller cloths. A damaged shirt might become rags, bandages, or cleaning cloth. The fabric moved through the household. Behind every piece of old linen, there was not only a plant and not only a set of tools, but a household of people. Flax was not the work of one pair of hands. It moved through many hands, slowly. Some of those hands pulled the plants from the field. Some tied the bundles. Some watched the retting water or spread the stalks on damp grass. Some broke the dried stems. Some scutched away the woody shives. Some drew the long fibers through iron teeth.
Some spun in the low light of an evening room, turning pale fiber into thread almost without looking. In many places, much of the fine work belonged to women. This was not because it was easy, it was because it was constant, exacting, and close to the rhythm of the house. A girl might learn to spin before she was grown, sitting beside her mother or grandmother, watching how the fingers teased out the flax, how the wheel was turned, how the thread was kept even. Too much pull, and the thread broke. Too little twist, and it drifted apart. The hand had to learn the feeling of it. Men often did the heavier outdoor work, though this was never a fixed rule everywhere. They prepared the ground, harvested, carried bundles, lifted wet flax from ponds, broke stalks with wooden brakes, or worked at the loom if weaving was a male trade in that place. In some towns and villages, linen passed from household labor into specialist hands. There were spinners, weavers, bleachers, merchants, and finishers. Each one took the material a little farther from the field and a little closer to the folded cloth. But even when linen entered trade, it kept something domestic about it. It was stored in chests, it was counted carefully, it was mended, washed, aired, handed down, cut apart, remade. A good linen sheet might represent not just money but hours that had been gathered over a long season. Work done in winter evenings, work done between other tasks, work done while children slept, while bread rose, while rain tapped on the roof. It is easy now to see cloth only as a surface, a shirt, a towel, a sheet on a bed. But for people before machines, cloth was also time. It was weather, soil, water, patience, and the repeated motion of human bodies. It held the ache of shoulders from harvesting, the damp smell of retting ponds, the dust from scutching, the soft rasp of hackles, the small steady sound of a spinning wheel. And because linen took so much work, it was never merely ordinary. Even when it was used every day, it belonged to the people who made it and to the people who cared for it afterward. In the quiet folds of the finished cloth there remained the memory of a field and of all the women and men who had turned that field into thread.
Not everything that came from the flax plant became fine linen. That is worth remembering, because in old work almost nothing was allowed to disappear without being considered first. The long, smooth fibers were saved for the best thread. They were hackled again and again, drawn through iron teeth until they lay straight and pale in the hand. But around them, beneath them, caught in the combs and scattered on the floor, there was always something rougher. This rough fiber was called tow. Tow was not beautiful in the same way as dressed flax. It was shorter, tangled, uneven, full of little broken ends. If fine flax looked like a fall of pale hair, tow looked more like a nest pulled from a hedge. It had bits of woody matter in it, and dust, and the dry smell of stalks that had been retted, broken, beaten, and combed. A careful worker would gather it up, shake it, sort it, and put it aside. It was waste in one sense. But waste did not mean useless. The best tow might still be spun. It made a coarse yarn, not smooth enough for a good shirt or a clean white sheet, but strong enough for rough cloth. Tow cloth could become sacking, aprons, work garments, wrappings, bags, or towels used in places where softness mattered less than usefulness. It scratched more against the skin, it darkened sooner, it carried the memory of the broken stalk more plainly than fine linen did, but it served. The poorer tow had other futures. It could be twisted into cord, it could be packed into cracks as a kind of caulking, it could be used for wicks, stuffing, binding, or tying. In a household or a workshop, small lengths of rough fiber were always useful. A bundle of tow near the wall was not a failure of the linen-making process, it was a quiet reserve of small solutions. Rope and cordage belonged to this same world of patient twisting. Flax was not the only fiber used for rope. Hemp was often preferred where great strength was needed, especially for ships, wagons, wells, and heavy hauling. But flax tow and other coarse plant fibers could be made into smaller cords, household lines, nets, ties, and bindings. The principle was simple and very old. Fibers that are weak alone become strong when they are twisted together. A person making cord would take a handful of fiber, dampen the fingers, and begin turning it. One twist held a few strands, another twist brought more strands into line, then several twisted lengths could be twisted back against each other so the tension locked them together. The result was not magical, it was only patience made visible.
The strength came from friction, from overlap, from many small things refusing to pull apart all at once. Imagine the sound of it in a quiet yard, fiber drawn through the hands, a low rasp, a slight creak from a hook or wooden wheel, dust floating in the afternoon light. Somewhere nearby, linen yarn is being woven for weaving, smooth and pale, but here in the rougher corner the leftovers are becoming something else: a cord for tying a bundle, a line for hanging cloth, a rope for pulling, fastening, holding. This is one of
By the time linen reached the household, folded and pale, it had already passed through many patient stages. The flax had been pulled from the field, soaked or left in dew, dried, broken, scraped, combed, spun, woven, washed, bleached and softened. Every inch of the cloth carried work inside it, not in a visible way exactly. A good piece of linen did not show the labor loudly. That was part of its value. It looked calm, clean, plain, almost modest. But people knew what it had taken. Linen was valued first because it was strong. The fibers of flax are long compared with many other plant fibers, and when they are properly prepared and spun, they make a thread that can endure a great deal of use. A linen sheet could be washed again and again. A shirt could be worn close to the skin, rubbed by work, soaked with sweat, scrubbed with soap or ash, and still survive. It might soften with age, but it did not quickly fall apart. This mattered in a world where cloth was expensive. Before machines, fabric was not something to buy casually and replace often. A shirt represented fields, tools, weather, hands, daylight and time. A sheet was not just bedding, it was stored labor, it was wealth that could be slept under. Linen was also valued because it could be made very clean, it tolerated washing well, it dried relatively quickly. It could be boiled, beaten, rinsed, spread on grass and whitened in the sun. In warm weather it felt cool against the body, and in a bed it had that dry, smooth feel that people associated with order and care. A chest of folded linen said something about a household. It meant preparation, it meant thrift, it meant that someone had spent many seasons turning raw plants into useful comfort. There was a difference, too, between coarse linen and fine linen. Coarse cloth might be used for sacks, towels, work shirts, aprons, mattress covers or wrapping. Fine linen, spun from the best long fibers and woven carefully, could become shirts for the better off, tablecloths, altar cloths, caps, cuffs, collars and bedding kept for important rooms or important guests. The same plant could serve the barn, the kitchen, the bed and the church. In some places, linen was part of a young woman's dowry. It was counted, stored and carried into a new household. Pieces might be marked with initials, they might be repaired rather than discarded. A tear could be patched, a worn sheet could become smaller cloths could become rags. Even at the end, the material still had a use. So linen was valued not because it was rare in the way jewels were rare, but because it held together so many quiet necessities of life. It touched the body, it covered the table, it wrapped the dead, it filtered, wiped, bound, cooled, warmed and lasted. And behind its plain surface there remained the memory of flax stems drying in bundles, combs pulling fiber into order, a spindle turning slowly in the hand, and cloth lying out in the pale sun becoming a little white. For a long time linen belonged to the pace of hands. The flax was pulled by hand. It was spread by hand. It was lifted from the retting pond or gathered from the damp field by people who knew, from smell and touch, when the woody stem had loosened enough. The stalks were dried, broken, scutched, hackled, spun, wound, warped, woven, bleached, beaten, folded and stored. At every stage there was judgment. Not the kind written down in a book necessarily, but the quieter kind that lived in the fingers. Machines did not change linen all at once, they came in pieces. A breaking machine could crush the dry flax stems more quickly than a person with a handbrake. A scutching mill could scrape away the woody shives with turning blades instead of a swinging wooden knife. Hackling frames could comb many bundles more evenly, drawing the long fibers into shining lines. Spinning machines could twist thread faster than a wheel, and later power looms could carry the shuttle back and forth without the steady pull of a weaver's arm.
Each machine solved a difficulty, each one saved time, and time was one of the great costs hidden inside every old piece of linen. Before machines, a shirt was not just cloth, it was a field's worth of planting and pulling, it was days of retting weather, it was the dull knock of the brake, the pale dust on the floor, the tug of fiber through iron teeth. It was a spinner sitting in low light, drawing out a thread that could not be hurried too much or it would break. It was a weaver keeping the rhythm of the loom one pass after another until the loose yarn became a surface. Machines made more linen possible, they made it cheaper, they made cloth less rare, and in many ways that mattered deeply. More people could own more shirts, beds could have more sheets, hospitals, ships, workshops and homes could use clean cloth in larger quantities. The material that had once carried the weight of long labor slowly became more ordinary, but something else changed too. When the work moved into mills, it moved away from the household, the yard, the village field, and the small workshop. The sounds changed. Instead of one wheel turning beside a hearth, there were rows of frames. Instead of the uneven pauses of human hands, there was the stronger rhythm of water power and later steam. Linen became less connected to a particular person's touch and more connected to systems of supply, fuel, wages, machines, and markets. The cloth itself could be finer, more regular, more predictable. Its threads could be more even, its weave could be repeated again and again, but the old irregularities began to disappear, the little variations in thread, the faint traces of weather, the small human hesitations held inside the fabric. So when we look at old handmade linen, we are not only looking at cloth before machines, we are looking at a different arrangement of time, a world where one plant passed.
At the end of all this work, there was the cloth, not the plant in the field anymore, not the blue-flowered flax standing in the wind, not the wet bundles lying in a pond, or the dry stalks cracking under a brake, or the pale fibers drawn through iron teeth, not the spindle turning slowly in a hand, not the loom with its steady crossing of warp and weft. All of that had passed into the linen. The finished cloth might be lifted from the bleaching grass and carried indoors in the evening light. It might still smell faintly of sun, damp earth, and clean water. It might be stiff in places, softening only with use. Its surface would not be perfectly even. A hand could feel the little changes in it. A thicker thread here, a slub there, a slight difference in tightness where the weaver's rhythm shifted just for a moment and then returned. Before machines, linen carried the memory of human pace. It was not made quickly, it could not be rushed very far. The flax needed its season, the retting needed its days. The fiber had to be broken, cleaned, combed, spun, wound, warped, woven, washed, bleached, beaten, and folded. Each step was ordinary, and none of them alone looked like much. But together they turned a green plant into something that could lie against the skin, cover a bed, wrap bread, line a chest, shade a window, or become a shirt worn thin by years of work. A folded piece of linen was therefore more than a household object. It was stored labor, it was summer weather, it was field work, water, wood smoke, aching fingers, patient spinning, and the knock of a loom in a quiet room. It was also care. Someone had grown it because cloth was needed, someone had guarded it from rot, someone had washed it and laid it in the sun, someone had folded it flat and put it away, perhaps in a wooden chest with herbs or dried flowers to keep it clean until it was wanted, and when it was wanted it was used without ceremony. A sheet was spread over a straw mattress, a shirt was pulled over tired shoulders, a cloth was laid across a table, a towel was hung near a basin. These were not grand moments, they were the small arrangements of daily life, but they mattered. Linen belonged close to the body and close to sleep. It touched people when they were ill, when they were young, when they were old, when they were resting after labor, and when the day had finally emptied itself out. Machines changed all of this. They made cloth faster, cheaper, wider, and more uniform. They brought linen and cotton into the reach of many more households. That mattered too. A world with more cloth was in many ways a kinder world, but something quiet was left behind. The old folded cloth still asks us to notice it.
not as a treasure exactly, just as a thing made slowly, a thing that began as a stem in a field and passed through many hands before it came to rest in a cupboard, pale and clean and waiting. And perhaps that is enough to remember, that before cloth was common it was cultivated, before it was bought it was made, before it was folded it was a plant standing in the weather, holding in its thin